Hello there. Welcome to Just the Discs. We talk about Blu-ray here, Blu-rays that is, and 4Ks. And today we're going to talk about a film that was definitely ahead of its time upon its release, and a film which caused a lot of trouble for the filmmaker who made it, and that was Michael Powell. I am talking about Peeping Tom from 1960, and this is in relation to the new 4K release from Criterion. Now, before I get into Peeping Tom, I have to talk a little bit about Powell and Pressburger because they are huge for me personally, and like so many people that discovered them, I discovered them through the recommendations of Martin Scorsese, and he was hugely responsible for this film in particular, finding an audience years after it had been roundly dismissed in an incredibly cruel way, if I'm honest. But so anyway, when I was in college, I was exploring cult cinema. I came upon the books of Danny Perry, which I've talked about. In fact, I'll read from Cult Movies 1 in a minute, his entry for Peeping Tom, which, might have been the first Powell and Pressburger adjacent film that I ever heard of, and could have been the first that I saw because of Perry's book, which, came out in the early 80s. But I didn't read until the 90s. But Powell and Pressburger got together. Two British filmmakers became known as the Archers, and they made such incredible works as The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, I Know Where I'm Going, A Matter of Life and Death, Black Narcissus, The Red Shoes, Tales of Hoffman, to name a few. And these are some of my favorite films. Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, when I first started working at a video store in Los Angeles called Laser Blazer, circa 1999, which, by the way, this is just of slight interest, Peeping Tom entered the Criterion Collection on DVD in 1999. And I want to say it was while I was there, it would have been November 1999. So I was working at this video store when this came out. And I remember it was a big deal. I was just finding my way into the Criterion Collection at that time. I had some exposure to it in college because our media center had some Criterion Laserdiscs, and one of my friends worked at the media center. And so we taped, for instance, Scorsese's Taxi Driver Laserdisc commentary and watched it, and we're just blown away. That was one of the first commentaries I'd ever heard, and it was just, incredible. And then, would go on to find Powell and Pressburger at my time at this video store because we got a lot of Laserdiscs in. We sold and bought Laserdiscs, and I remember when Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, the Criterion Laserdisc, came across our desk, and I was like, oh my gosh, this has a Scorsese commentary on it. I have to hear that, because I had heard, it was all of this confluence of things. Like, I remember Wes Anderson's Rushmore Criterion DVD coming out, and that commentary being so seminal for me. I recorded it onto audio tape. I used to listen to it in my car driving around, and he had specific comments about Powell and Pressburger, and I think even Scorsese and the Laserdiscs and things like that. And I was like, okay, I got to check this out. So not only did I love the movie, it is truly one of my favorite, World War II films, although that's really not what it's about. Like many Wes Anderson films, Life and Death of Colonel Blimp is about friendship. But the commentary was just astonishing, and I absolutely adored it. And I had to find more of these Powell and Pressburger films, and so I sought out The Red Shoes, and I sought out, I wouldn't come to some of them for a little while. Like I think I saw Black Narcissus and The Red Shoes relatively close together, and those knocked me out. But later I would find I Know Where I'm Going and A Matter of Life and Death, which I think are just absolutely, I mean, just like I said, two of my favorite movies. I Know Where I'm Going, especially, still a little underrated, even considering it's part of the Criterion Collection. It's only on DVD. I think the rest have gotten Blu-rays. That's one that hasn't. So here's hoping it does get a Blu-ray or a 4K upgrade. It's truly, truly spectacular love story. Anyway, so I just became obsessed with these guys, and finding out about them and how they sort of got their start. They sort of found each other, and they became the Archers. They adopted a very unique joint writer, producer, director credit for their film One of Our Aircraft is Missing from 1942, and made reference to the Archers in the credits of that movie. And then they incorporated their own production company, Archers Film Productions, which is this great multicolored target the arrows fly into. And the joint credit, written, produced, and directed by Michael Powell and Pressburger, indicates their joint responsibility for the work, that they weren't beholden to any studio or any other producers. It's kind of crazy in terms of the run they had. We talk about great runs of filmmaking, from, whoever, Bogdanovich or, Walter Hill or Scorsese, whatever you want. These guys had this remarkable run. And I guess in a letter to Wendy Hiller in 1942, asking to appear in Colonel Blimp, Pressburger explicitly set out the Archers Manifesto. Its 5 points express the pair's intentions, and the 5 points were as follows. We owe allegiance to nobody except the financial interests which provide our money, and to them the sole responsibility of ensuring them a profit, not a loss. 2, every single foot in our films is our own responsibility and nobody else's. We refuse to be guided or coerced by any influence but our own judgment. Point 3, when we start work on a new idea, we must be a year ahead, not only of our competitors, but also of the times. A real film from the idea to universal release takes a year or more. Point 4, no artist believes in escapism, and we secretly believe that no audience does. We have proved at any rate that they will pay to see the truth for other reasons than her nakedness. And point 5, at any time, and particularly at the present, the self-respect of all collaborators from star to prop man is sustained or dismissed by the theme and purpose of the film they are working on. And I just love that they had a manifesto, but they just really, I just can't express, like, I know these films are known now, and the Criterion Collection has been championing them since the 90s with a lot of Laserdisc releases and DVD releases and Blu-ray releases and now 4K releases. Is this the first of their films to get a 4K from Criterion? It might be. But their collaboration was remarkable. Pressburger, I mean, they both, did all things, but ultimately Powell was more the director and, Pressburger was more a writer-producer, but they took that joint credit. And I love the lack of ego there. That's just sort of saying, we are creating this thing. So they were really remarkable artist filmmakers from, very early on. And, eventually they, Michael Powell decides to I guess do this on his own. Like, that's the specifics. Their particular, when they stopped working together, I don't know the specifics of that part of it, but I do know that, in 1960 or 1959, I guess, when they would have been making it, Powell, was approached by a new screenwriter named Leo Marx, who he was given this script. I guess there was some talk of, like, Powell was going to make a Freud movie, and boy, Freud would have a field day with Peeping Tom. But then he'd heard that John Huston was making one, and they wanted to be ahead of things, and so he decided not to make that. And he instead was approached with this script for Peeping Tom, which, if you watch the movie now, I mean, what is, I'm just curious, how are they, having brought British cinema into exalted realms of fantasy and imagination, Michael Powell took a dark detour into obsession, voyeurism, and violence with this groundbreaking meta-cinematic investigation into the mechanics of fear. Armed with his killer camera, photographer, and filmmaker Mark Lewis, Carl Bohm unleashes the traumas of his childhood by murdering young women and recording their deaths until he falls for his downstairs neighbor and finds himself struggling against his dark compulsions. Received with revulsion upon its release, only to be reclaimed as a masterpiece, the endlessly analyzed, still shocking Peeping Tom dares viewers to confront their own relationship to the violence on screen. Okay. Yeah, so he responded to this script, and again, watching it now, it's still disturbing to watch, however many years later. And I just can't imagine what it would have been like at the time. I mean, the thing I always think of is, and the fact that this film destroyed Michael Powell's career. It legitimately basically ended it. He had to go to Australia. He couldn't raise funding in Europe. All this great work that he and Emmerich Pressburger had done was disregarded, more or less. And then obviously reclaimed again later too. But to think about all the great films they made, and not even to mention Thief of Baghdad, which I left off. That's a Michael Powell movie. It's just shocking to me how the critics came down on it. But that speaks to how effective a film it was and how it really got under the skin of these critics who said things like should be flushed down the toilet, and all the critics of the UK should hold the chain, and the stench will still remain. I mean, they just reviled this movie. They hated it so much. And it's just, kind of crazy. You watch it now, again, it's shocking, but have we seen much more shocking films since? Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. I mean, there's tons of movies that put you in the shoes of a murderer. And I think this one still does something that maybe some of those others don't do, which is it really tries to draw sympathy for him. And here's the other thing that I think is fascinating. So this movie comes out circa April 1960, April 7th or something, in the UK, and is just destroyed. I think it's pulled from theaters within a week of its release because of this incredible backlash. Several months later, September, I believe, of 1960, Psycho comes out in the United States. Hitchcock, I mean, to be fair, like, the studios were not into that movie either. And he, I think, put up his own money. I don't remember how much or whatever he did, but something like an $800,000 film returns $50 million in 1960. It's a huge success, his greatest success ever. And his career is completely boosted by it. And as shocking as that was, but he's a guy who knew how to market a film, and he really marketed the heck out of it and made it, helped make it the phenomenon that it was. But I do think it's so fascinating that these two films come out so close together. But here's the thing. So this movie comes out in a world where Psycho does not yet exist. So you have not yet seen Norman Bates. You have not yet been made to feel sympathy for a murderer like him. So this is really on the cutting edge, and that's something that's addressed in the extras here. Thelma Schoonmaker actually says that, and she was married to Michael Powell from 1984 to 1990 and was introduced to his films by Scorsese and obviously adored them. But she said that Michael realized that being on the cutting edge of art, film in this case, art, means that you're out on a limb sometimes, and you run the risk of having that limb sawed off underneath you. And so he apparently was obviously probably disappointed, but also accepting of the fact that this film was just too much, that it just was right on that line and crossed over and really got under people's skin. So I don't know. I just think it's fascinating they both came out. The other thing that's interesting about this movie is, it stars Carl Boehm, but it also stars Anna Massey as the downstairs neighbor that he falls for. And 12 years later, 1972, Hitchcock returns to the UK to make Frenzy, which to date is like his most extreme and graphic film in terms of another film that follows a murderer. I don't know if it necessarily makes you sympathize with him, but it kind of does. You kind of don't want him to get caught, or I don't know. There are moments where you're like, oh dear, he's going to get caught. But he casts Anna Massey in a very prominent role in Frenzy, and she becomes, slight spoiler for Frenzy, she becomes one of the killer's victims. And I think that's fascinating. I won't go into what happens to her in Peeping Tom, but it is different than that. But I do think that the interconnection between Hitchcock and Powell and these two films, Psycho and Peeping Tom, just kind of really bemuses me, and I don't know. But this is definitely a film that was, again, ahead of its time. It's very modern. It's more modern than the kind of films Michael Powell was making at the time with Emmerich Pressburger, and it's a big leap forward in terms of style. But the similarities between Norman Bates and Mark Lewis, the main character of Peeping Tom, are pretty startling in a way, because Mark Lewis is he's a photographer. He works as a focus puller at a studio. He's obsessed with filming things. He's always carrying around it looks like a Bolex of some kind or something, and he's always filming. And he develops his own film. He has a dark room. He basically lives in the house that his parents lived in, but now he rents out the downstairs rooms and just has a room upstairs in his dark room off the side, a large dark room, by the way, where he can project film and develop it. But so he carries his camera with him everywhere and films a lot of things. And we come to discover that part of what's messed him up, if you will, is that his father, interestingly played by Michael Powell himself, and Michael Powell cast his own son, Columba, as the young Mark Lewis, which I think is really intriguing. I think he just thought it would be kind of fun to have his son on this film, and it wasn't that much more significant than that. And they used Columba's actual mom, Michael Powell's wife, her hand. I won't get into the specifics of that, but she's involved in that too. So the real family affair, if you will. But so anyway, so Mark Lewis, his father, was interested in psychology and the reaction of the human mind to fear, specifically his child. So he's filming his son being scared, like scaring his son, waking him up in the middle of the night, throwing a giant lizard on his bed, and watching his son react and taking notes and not sympathizing, and obviously created something of a monster through that. And Norman Bates obviously has a similar trauma with a parent that leads them both characters to be compulsive murderers, to the point they can't control themselves. They need to see, in this case, Mark needs to see the reaction of a person's face when they realize they're about to die. And he photographs that. And so he kills several women in this movie that way. And I won't go into how. I'll leave that for you to discover if you haven't seen the film. But yeah, the parallels between the two movies and the complete gulf between the responses is kind of remarkable to me. So anyway, it's an astonishing film to this day, and you can feel. It's hard to put it in context, but you can still feel this unease with, the Mark Lewis character, and feeling your sympathy for him as he realizes his problem when he falls for Anna Massey, and how he wants to correct it and finds that maybe he can't. But he is trying. He doesn't want to be this way, and so it becomes a thing where you can't help but have some sympathy for him. And, these critics just really resented the idea of being made to have sympathy for a murderer. It was just not something that was done that way at that time. You know, if you had a gangster movie, you know, they got it in the end, and I just don't feel like you had the same sympathy, you know, and studios, especially in the States, were always pointing at such things and saying, this is bad, and he got punished for it. And this movie is examining the ambiguity between sort of the gray area of human behavior. And another thing that comes up in the extras is this idea of villains, and that both, you know, Powell and Pressburger and Scorsese don't like the idea of a traditional villain. They want to examine, again, that gray area, you know, because I always come back to a line in The Talented Mr. Ripley, I think it's a line from that, where Matt Damon says, nobody thinks they're a bad person. I really think about that one a lot, actually, in real life, when I come across people that I find to be less than sympathetic, let's say. You can't see the world from their point of view. From their point of view, they're not a bad person. You know, they don't do bad things for their sake, you know. So I think Scorsese and Powell and Pressburger were always interested in examining the idea of villains, and you know, so Raging Bull he's not a villain, but he does some pretty horrible things. So that's really tricky. I keep this really spun me out. This rewatch of Peeping Tom started making me think about Wolf of Wall Street, which is, for me, a Scorsese film I'm still grappling with, one that I still find it difficult to enjoy per se. Like, I do appreciate it, but there's just some really heinous stuff in it, and I may be having that, you know, 1960s British critic reaction to it, where I'm upset that I'm made to sort of sympathize with criminals. I would like to think I'm above that, but I'm examining my own reaction to that film in the wake of watching this and going through the extras on this. Anyway, I will say this 4K looks lovely. The film was shot in Eastman color, which Scorsese comments a couple times is sort of a lurid color that would be associated with pornography, and just it has a different vibrance to it. It's not the same as the sort of Technicolor stuff of, you know, Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, Black Narcissus. As dark as that film is, the color is just incredible. Red Shoes, obviously incredible color. This is different, you know, and it fits the material in that way. But the detail is really incredible. It just looks great. I hadn't seen it in a long time. I may not have seen it since that DVD. It could have been like 25 years since I've seen this movie. So I couldn't remember it very well, if I'm honest. I remembered certain things about it. I didn't remember the ending specifically, but I do think this presentation is great. Now, of course, this has a 4K and a Blu-ray, and the 4K disc, as per usual, doesn't include all the extras. The 4K has 2 audio commentaries. Now, I don't think any of this stuff is new. I mean, it may be new from the 25-year-old DVD, because, in fact, it is, because, you know, it's one of those things where it came out then, and I want to say they have released it on Blu-ray since, right? Criterion, that is. I'm forgetting my dates now. So the DVD is 1999. When is the... I don't know if they ever... You know what? I don't know if Criterion ever put it out on Blu-ray. I'm not 100% sure. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, I know I never had it. I had a UK import Blu-ray of it. So this may be the 25th anniversary release from the DVD. Anyway, so there will be new stuff from if you only own that DVD. If you've owned other versions like the one that I had, you'll have seen these extras because they've been around. But on the 4K, you have 2 audio commentaries, one featuring film historian Ian Christie, who's also part of one of the documentaries that's included, and another one featuring film scholar Laura Mulvey. You get an introduction to the film by Martin Scorsese, of course, and that is about 2 minutes, but he really does get into it, in that 2 minutes. He's talking about the film getting behind or to the heart of the impulse behind filmmaking and how close a movie can come to madness. Movie making can come to madness, that is. And he said that, at the time he saw it, could this have been the same man that made the Red Shoes? And it took him a while, but he was able to link the two, and he said that the two films are linked in showing that art can consume you, which is an interesting take. So just a short intro from him, but I love hearing him talk about these filmmakers. He is the reason that I love them as much as I do, because I was able to find them because of his love for them. So Thelma Schoonmaker, there's an interview from her. I want to say these are from 2007, maybe? So nothing brand new. About 10 and a half minutes, and she was, of course, married, as I said, to Michael Powell from 1984 to 1990 when he died. She says Peeping Tom didn't get a good release in the U.S. and talks about when Scorsese saw it for the first time, which was after he had discovered Powell and Pressburger, and apparently was able to get it entered into the New York Film Festival. He bought a print of it because it was really hard to see. It became like basically an underground film. After it got pulled, it was sold to another distributor and it was gone, it just disappeared. And I know this is a weird thing in the time of all movies available at your fingertips now in one form or another, whether it's on the internet or streaming or whatever. The idea of an absolutely lost film seems maybe inconceivable to some, but this is what happened a lot before home video. And so this film was lost, and he bought a print of it, and he got it entered into the New York Film Festival, where it was a huge hit. And then he would put up some of his own money, I want to say like $5,000, to have it re-released. And I couldn't find the date of when he did that, but I would assume it's in the late 70s, early 80s. I can't be sure. But, she talks about how he educated her on the films of Powell and Pressburger right around the time they were making Raging Bull. And that Peeping Tom was not one of the first films that he showed her of theirs. And yeah, the thing about the villains I took from her, not wanting to show villains. And she also says that the response of the critics in England to the film at the time was so shocking and vicious, and that Michael Powell quite deliberately published some of the reviews in their entirety in his autobiography to give a sense of just how intense and insane the reaction to the film was. And I think that is telling, that he was like, look, you have to read this. And the other bummer is that she mentions that the distributor at the time did not have the courage to take those reviews and say, these are what the critics are saying. This is how much they hate the movie. Why don't you come see for yourself? Which is something a lot of smart distributors would do if a film was lambasted by critics. It would be turning that against them. Come see for yourself. They were not going to do that. This film, the backlash was too strong. They were too afraid of it, and it got buried. But yeah, it was about the feeling getting under the skin of these critics, and they just resented it so much. And yeah, like I said, the part about being a filmmaker on the edge of the, cutting edge of what you're doing, and how that you run the risk of, being sawed off, that was from her. She talks about that here. She draws comparisons to Scorsese and the reaction to things like Raging Bull and Casino. Obviously, we think of Raging Bull as a classic, but apparently it wasn't universally well received at the time, and nor was Casino, although Casino is much more lauded now. People see it as like not just reductively not Goodfellas. It is its own thing, and it is a great movie. I'm a huge Casino fan. But okay, so what else do we have here? We have, okay, additionally, there are a few documentaries here. We have Eye of the Beholder, almost 19 minutes. 2005 documentary that features interviews with Martin Scorsese, Thelma Schoonmaker, Powell's son Columba, actor Carl Bohm, who of course played Mark Lewis, and film historian Ian Christie. And they talk about, again, how hard the film was to see, something of an underground film. Scorsese said filmmaker Jim McBride turned him onto it, and it was a big influence on Jim McBride's David Holzman's Diary, which, if you haven't seen that, that was right on the cutting edge of, verite cinema, just a story about a guy making a film about himself that goes bad. And it's great. I love that movie, but it is on the cusp itself. So I love that Peeping Tom inspired that. And there's a lot of like verite, like Mark Lewis. One of the things that's brought up in one of the docs, Mark Lewis is himself something of a verite filmmaker. He's shooting the aftermath of one of his murders, the cops coming to pick up the body. He's out in the streets shooting footage, He says to one guy, actually, he's working on a documentary, which is not true, but in a way, he's on the cutting edge of what would become one of the next movements in cinema, this cinema verite, low budget, in the run and gun in the streets kind of filmmaking. But yeah, this one goes into the history of Powell and how he found his way into filmmaking and the Powell Pressburger stuff and the examination of the response to it. It's a neat little doc, I gotta say. And then the other doc that's included is called A Very British Psycho, and that's about 50 minutes. And it's a 1997 doc. This one, I believe, was included on the DVD, Criterion, the original, about the life of Peeping Tom screenwriter Leo Marx, who also wrote Twisted Nerve, by the way, if you're aware of that film that Tarantino sort of brought to prominence again, being a fan of it. But it also includes interviews with Marx himself, actors Carl Bohm, again, Pamela Green, and actor Anna Massey as well, talking about their responses. Carl Bohm has a devastating story of the premiere of Peeping Tom, where they went and they were the honored guests at the screening, and they were brought down to greet the audience or the guests, and people wouldn't even look at them after the film was over, and they left without even speaking to them. And it was that time they realized something was horribly wrong. But it's a great and heartbreaking story, and there's a lot of good stories in this documentary. Hearing about Leo Marx and how some of the movie is sort of based on his own life, in terms of one of the guys that Mark Lewis deals with is a bookseller who also dabbles in pornography, and not explicit pornography, but like burlesque sort of photography, dirty pictures, if you will, at the time. And there's a scene of a guy, an older gentleman, coming in to get a newspaper and then asking about dirty pictures, more or less, and being mortified when a young girl comes in to get a Crunch bar. But apparently a little bit of that was based on Leo Marx's dad, I think, who owned a bookstore that had something similar, or I can't remember I'm not going to say his dad was a pornographer, but that there was something of a similarity in terms of that stuff. But yeah, it's truly a really memorable film, and one that to this day I can see why it was so controversial, even now. And the performance by Carl Bohm is really great, really just impactful stuff. There was some talk of using another actor, I want to say like Dirk Bogarde or was it Lawrence Harvey or Dirk? I can't remember. Somebody who wasn't available, but I will say, that could have been disastrous to whichever actor it was. But B, I just think the fact that I'd never seen this actor before really, makes the film that much more powerful, makes it feel more real in a way. Like you have no other attachments to this guy, and thus it really just arrives in a certain way. Anyway, beautiful 4K digital restoration, uncompressed monaural soundtrack, and I didn't even read from so the essays we have. Megan Abbott does a big old essay in here. I'll just read a little bit of that and then a little bit of the Perry thing, and then we'll call it quits here. The making of Peeping Tom began with an irresistible enticement. Director Michael Powell sat down with writer and World War II cryptographer Leo Marx to discuss a possible collaboration. At that time, Powell was looking for a writer with whom to partner after the end of his storied collaboration with Emmerich Pressburger on the myriad films that helped define British cinema, including The Red Shoes and A Matter of Life and Death. Mark's initial pitches to make a film about a double agent or one about Freud had gone nowhere, but the third time was the charm. As Powell tells it in his memoir, the sly Mark sat down, leaned toward me, fixed me with a penetrating gaze, and said, "Mr. Powell, how would you like to make a film about a young man with a camera who kills women that he photographs?" "That's me," Powell replied instantly. "I'd like that very much." So anyway, that's just the opening of that essay. I always enjoy their essays in Criterion. And then I'll just, as promised, I want to read just the intro from Cult Movies, which is where I first heard about this movie. Upon its 1960 release, Peeping Tom was damned by British newspaper critics like no film in memory. The picture about a filmmaker who murders his subjects as he films them was not merely judged trashy or amoral, but was called Sadian, necrophilic, perverted, destructive, a blight on the British cinema. The most famous quote is Derek Hill's in the Tribune. "The only really satisfactory way to dispose of Peeping Tom would be to shovel it up and flush it swiftly down the nearest sewer. Even then, the stench would remain." Ironically, director Michael Powell had done more than anyone to establish the proud British cinema film tradition, but sadly, critics were forgetting about such noteworthy achievements as The Thief of Baghdad, The 49th Parallel, One of Our Aircraft is Missing, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, Black Narcissus, The Red Shoes, The Small Black Room, and The Tales of Hoffman. Instead, they pointed out that they believed what they believed was the first sign of Powell's perversity, when Eric Portman pours glue into a girl's hair in Canterbury Tale. After 30 years as a writer and director, Powell was an outcast in his own country as a result of Peeping Tom and considered unbankable by studio heads. Because of the harsh press, the picture failed miserably, although its backers made a last-ditch effort to make it presentable by excising scenes the critics found objectionable. Unfortunately, it was this badly butchered version that briefly played in the United States grindhouses in 1962, and for years, Americans waited to see the notorious full-length version that had created such a furor across the Atlantic. Finally, in 1979, chiefly through the efforts of Martin Scorsese, a beautiful uncut 35mm print was screened at the New York Film Festival. So there you go, 79. And on the art house circuit. As a result, impressed American critics joined the French and Italians in vindicating a fascinating film that was too far ahead of its time to be appreciated by the British in 1960. And it says, to set the record straight, it was Britain's daily press which, reflecting the attitudes of its readership, lambasted it. Trade reviews were much kinder. Interesting. But anyway, that will do it for this episode. Hopefully, if you haven't seen this film or if you haven't seen the other Powell Pressburger films I mentioned, those get my absolute highest recommendation, and you should rush to see them as soon as possible. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.